Thank you very much for having me here today. So it's my dog and Lisa are making friends now. So I'm going to give you a whistle-stop tour of the effects of a bias that affects us all. It affects me as well as you. And I'm going to show you how this bias affects our collection and analysis of data, which in turn has a serious impact on how we design pretty much anything. So, given you all work in digital, bear with me here, but I'm sure you've all come across the very cliched phrase, data is the new oil. So the idea is, as I'm sure you all know, but just in case someone is here who's like a really big fan of me and knows fuck all about data and health, the idea is that data, it could happen. The idea is that data is extremely valuable. So, like oil, it is this century's driver of the economy, much as in the 19th and 20th century, the oil drove the Industrial Revolution, right? Both of these products have the possibility to upend our world and reshape it in its own image. Some very smug people actually take the analogy even further, and they say, well, see, actually, data's like oil because you've got to refine it before you can use it. It's very, very clever. No argument with that. But as digital people, you've probably also heard a lot of critiques of this analogy. One of the most common ones being that, well, okay, data is like oil in that it makes lots of money, but it's not finite. It's infinite. So you should probably compare it more to something like a renewable, which is also very clever. Other analogies that have been suggested include water and even blood, which probably comes closest to dealing with the issues I have with these kinds of analogies, given the personalized nature of blood and data. But it still falls down in the same way all these analogies do, which is that they frame data as a tangible substance that has its own inherent properties, irrespective of how we engage with it, how we gather it. It frames data as somehow sitting out there waiting in the ether for us to extract it. Now, this is very understandable because this is how we tend to think of numbers. People trust data because numbers seem neutral and objective and just existing out there. But data is far more tricksy than that. And data, in fact, does not exist apart from us. It's not a discrete entity, unlike water or oil or even blood. It is intrinsically, subjectively human. And that means that we cannot simply treat data as objective, neutral facts upon which we can make objective decisions. Data, like the humans that have created it, is slippery and shaped by a whole host of factors that we must take into account whenever we are dealing with it. Questions like, who has done the data collection and how have they done the data collection? Who have they gathered the data from? What questions have been asked to elicit this supposedly neutral data? Or even before that, what data have we decided we even need to collect? What is the problem that we think we most need to solve that we've decided we need to collect this data for? None of these are objective decisions, and they all end up having a huge impact on the data that ends up in our possession. So I'm just going to run through quickly a couple of examples to show you the kind of thing I mean. So this is to show you the impact of how you ask the question. So these are from a World Bank paper looking at the impact of how you ask questions on labour force participation rates. So paid employment and earning statistics are some of the most important variables used to identify the causes of poverty as well as the pathways out for households and for an economy. So it's incredibly important to have consistent data on these issues. But the way we gather these data is anything but consistent because humans are not consistent. And the interpretation of commonly used words like job or work or domestic duties can be interpreted completely differently depending on what region the question is being asked or the person to whom the question is being asked. So, for example, ignoring secondary activities, which may represent a significant amount of time in a woman's life, for example, who might say that her primary activity is domestic duty, but her secondary activity is agriculture. But if we don't factor in the secondary activities, we're missing a whole load of paid engagement and economic activity that women are doing. Similarly, framing paid economic activity and economic inactivity as mutually exclusive can also create huge problems here. And essentially, these tend to create a major undercounting of female labor force participation rates. So a 2010 study in Tanzania found that simply asking, did you do any work in the last 7 days, even for 1 hour, resulted in a 10% decline in self-reported female labor force participation rates, compared with a detailed module showing this is what we consider work to be. Interestingly, when husbands were asked the same questions regarding their wives, an even greater undercounting occurred. But even if you did manage to capture accurate data, if you analyze it carelessly or without a knowledge or an understanding of gender, you may end up causing lots of problems, like, for example, not sex disaggregating by proxy, which is something that happens a lot in the transport sector. Don't worry, we'll get onto health eventually. So this on the left is how transport planners have traditionally collected data. They have not aggregated travel for care altogether. Rather, they've split it down into lots of different blocks, as you see. And it's mixed together with leisure travel. So you've got shopping, which obviously a lot of that is to buy groceries, for example, but it also is mixed up with leisure shopping. You've got escorting, strolling, all these things, and they're separated up. But you've got paid employment all together in one block. And if you look at the table on the left, you can see why you would think, well, it's really obvious that we would design our public transport system around travel for paid employment, because that is by far and away the number one reason that people are traveling. But if you look at the table on the right, which was created by an urban planner in Madrid, she decided, well, what happens if I actually, like we do with paid employment, bring all the unpaid care work travel together? What difference would that make? And as you can see, it makes a pretty big difference. It means that paid employment is no longer the number one obvious reason people are traveling. There's a pretty strong contender. She also found that travel for unpaid care work is the main reason that women are traveling. Why does this matter? Well, it matters obviously if you care about creating public transport systems that serve women equally with men, but it also matters because if you want to get women into the paid workforce, you need to account for the unpaid care work that they're going to need to be doing and help them to be able to combine the two. Right, so one thing you might have noticed if you're paying a lot of attention is that in both those examples there is one common feature. And that feature is that women were undercounted in both those examples. And that is not a coincidence. In fact, that is the case for most data sets in the world that you care to look at. So the vast majority of information that has been collected globally and that we continue to collect, everything from economic data to urban planning data to medical data, see I told you I'd get onto medical, has been collected on men. So that's male bodies, typical male lifestyle patterns. And this means that pretty much everything in the world, from the office you work in, to the transport you use to get there, whether public or private, because cars are also not designed for women, to the medical treatment you receive, to the phone in your hand, to the apps on that phone, have been designed to work better for men. And the result of that is that most things in the world just don't work that well for women. So this is what I call the gender data gap. Now, the first rule of the gender data gap is that it's not a conspiracy. Right? It's not the product of the brainchild of an evil group of data scientists who got together one day back in the 50s and were like, we really know how we're going to screw with women, right? That was not what happened, I don't think. They're probably not that clever. What it is the product of a way of thinking, and this goes back to the bias that I mentioned at the beginning, that we all share, and it's a way of thinking that goes back millennia, and it's centered around a good friend of mine called Reference Man. A Reference Man, as you can see, is the world's worst superhero. He is Caucasian, he's 70 kilograms, and bless him, he thinks he represents everyone. Of course, he does not. Now, to be fair on Reference Man, he didn't dream himself into existence. He was brought into existence a long time ago by a number of other men, most notably perhaps my good friend Aristotle, who, along with other questionable views of women, believed that the female body was a mutilated male body. The first departure from type This was him writing in 4th century BC in his biological treatise on the generation of animals. The first departure from type is indeed that the offspring should become female instead of male. So male was the type from which the female departed. The thing that I will say in defense of Aristotle was, despite thinking of females as mutilated males, he did think, well, on the other hand, you know, females are necessary for the propagation of the human species, so we'll probably allow them to continue existing, which is very, very thoughtful and nice of him. Moving on through to the Renaissance and the explosion of medical and anatomical drawings that you see in that era, you can carry on seeing and tracking this mode of thinking. So as you can see here, we have an illustration of the female scrotum, and on either side are the female testicles. Obviously, that's the uterus and the ovaries. The thing that I find really interesting, though, about these drawings in particular is not just that you have, you know, the female-male thing, the female-male thing. It's the way that they thought of the female body versus the male body, which was that they thought of the female body as the male body turned outside in. What do I mean by that? I mean that they thought, obviously, the default normal way to have your reproductive organs is have them dangling down outside. Only a really weird body that has got something wrong with it would have them inside. And the explanation they had for that was that females lacked vital heat, right? There was a deficiency in the female body. And what I find really interesting about that is you go back to Aristotle and you see how this is, again, representing the male body as the type from which the female body deviates. But you could just as easily say it the other way around, that the female body is the standard type from which the male deviates. Indeed, I feel you could make a very good argument for that. You know, surely it makes more sense to have these very delicate organs up inside your body, nice and protected, rather than dangling down where any fool can hit them. Anyway, so there's just a few historical examples for you to see about the trajectory of this type of thinking that I'm talking about. But I'm sure while you all think this is very funny and hilarious, obviously we've moved on now. Nobody thinks of the female body as a mutilated male body anymore. Nobody thinks that the male body is the type, the standard from which the female body departs. Well, what about this? I'm sure you've seen lots of posters like this in various places. Anyway, so you've got here the man who has his standard pelvis and his standard genitals, and then you've got the little weird female pelvis off to one side. Same here, nervous system. There's the male nervous system. You've got the little weird atypical female pelvis again. The muscular system versus the female muscular system. You know, he's obviously very impressive and strong, and she is, you know, doing her best to be sexy, which I think you have to, you know, you've got to give her credit for that. She's flayed. It's not easy for her. But anyway, the effect of reference man, which is what this is in the world of medicine, is that the vast majority of our medical knowledge is based on the male body. So female humans, animals, and even female cells are still routinely excluded from clinical research. So for example, heart disease, which is the leading cause of death for women in Europe and the US. A recent meta-analysis of 31 landmark trials found that women made up only 25% of participants across those trials. Women represent 55% of HIV-positive adults in the developing world. In parts of Africa and the Caribbean, women aged 5 to 24 are up to 6 times more likely to be HIV positive than men of the same age. We also know that women experience different clinical symptoms and complications due to HIV. And yet, a recent analysis, again, on the inclusion of women in US HIV research found that women made up only 19.2% of participants in antiretroviral studies and only 11.1% in studies to find a cure. And in fact, women aren't even included in studies where it's literally for a product just for women. So I don't know if you saw a few years ago the sort of heralding of this new female Viagra, which was going to be great. Women were going to be horny the whole time. Everyone was going to be really happy. But they came up with this slight problem with this female Viagra, which was, well, it might interact negatively with alcohol. So, you know, they thought, well, we probably should test this So they did on 23 men and 2 women. So that was interesting, because you don't need to be a doctor to know that male and female alcohol tolerance is just a little bit different. And of course, as I mentioned, this was female Viagra, so men were literally never going to be taking it. Well, I don't know, I wouldn't like to judge. Anyway, so that leads me on to another story about Viagra. So I am sure you all know how the original Viagra, the standard Viagra, got discovered, right? Do you? You don't. Some of you do, some of you don't. Okay, so I'll tell you the story. So it was discovered in an all-male drug trial for heart disease medication. Anyway, it turned out it didn't really work very well for heart disease, but it had this happy side effect. So this was in the early 90s, and by a few years later, it was in full-scale trials and was on the market as Viagra by 1998, FDA approved. But in 2013, a medical researcher realized that the active ingredient in Viagra may actually be beneficial for women who suffer from period pain, for which the women in the audience will know there isn't really a lot out there that really works. And so he decided to, see, some men are nice. He decided to do a small-scale trial on this active ingredient whose name I can't pronounce, certainly not in front of a bunch of medics. But anyway, so the primary hypothesis was that it would provide 4 hours of pain relief with no side effects. Now, the initial results were very promising, but he couldn't prove his hypothesis because they ran out of funding and the trial didn't manage to finish, and so he kept applying for more funding to be able to prove this hypothesis with larger scale studies. Those studies have never taken place because the National Institute of Health in America kept turning down his application for funding because they didn't see period pain as a serious health issue. Now, this is primarily a story about the importance of including women in medical trials, right? Like, imagine if we had had women in those very first trials. Alongside discovering the happy side effect for men, we might have discovered a happy side effect for women, and at that point it would have been interesting perhaps for drug companies to get involved because it was prior to the drug being generic. Of course, by now it's no use to anyone, and we'll never be able to know whether Viagra is of any use for period pain. By the way, don't take Viagra for period pain. Someone on Twitter the other day was talking about their terrible period pain, and someone replied saying, "Oh, I read this bit in Invisible Women where, like, they found that period pain can be cured for 4 hours by Viagra." And obviously I had to step in and say, no, it's not medical advice. It's not been tested. Abort. Obviously I don't need to tell you guys that. But that's slightly worrying. I did make it very clear in the book that it has not gone through clinical tests. Anyway, but it's also a story about who gets funded and what gets funded and why. And again, this Viagra example is not an isolated example of things playing out in favor of men. So, for example, another recent meta-analysis found that there are 5 times as many studies for erectile dysfunction as there are for PMS, even though over 40% of women don't respond to currently available treatments. A recent analysis of the US National Institute of Health grants also found that the lowest award rate was for applications using the terms ovary, fertility, and reproductive. So I'd like to give you an example of the kind of research that might have been included in these grants. This wasn't actually submitted to the NIH, this was submitted to the British Medical Research Council. But this was a study on reproductive health. So as I'm sure you know, every day around the world, 830 women die due to complications in pregnancy and childbirth. Over half of those deaths are explained as being a result of problems with contractions, often because the contractions are too weak. So there is only one medical treatment for contractions that are too weak, and that is the hormone oxytocin, which only works about 50% of the time. Women who don't respond to oxytocin are given an emergency cesarean. Now, in the UK, weak contractions are the reason given for a majority of the 100,000 emergency cesareans carried out each year. And we currently have no way of knowing which women will respond to the hormone, until this researcher a professor of cellular and molecular physiology at the University of Liverpool, Professor Susan Ray, started looking into it. First of all, she found that women with contractions that are too weak to give birth vaginally have more acid in their myometrial blood, and the higher the levels of the acid, the higher the likelihood a woman will end up needing a cesarean, basically because oxytocin isn't that effective on women with an acidic blood pH. So Ray conducted a randomized controlled trial on the women in her care. She also worked in the birthing hospital. She wasn't just getting women to come in and give birth in her lab. And half of them were given the usual oxytocin, and half of them were given bicarbonate of soda, and then given the usual oxytocin an hour later. And the change was dramatic. 67% of women given just oxytocin went on to give birth vaginally, but this rose to 84% if they were given bicarbonate of soda an hour before. Now, bear in mind, of course, this bicarb dose wasn't tailored to body weight, it wasn't tailored to the amount of acid in the blood, and the women weren't given repeated doses. So ultimately, the effect could end up being much higher. And this finding could be transformative not only for the tens of thousands of women a year who turn out to have unnecessary surgery in the UK, not to mention saving the NHS probably quite a lot of money, but also could be transformative for women who live in countries where having an emergency cesarean can be life-threatening. Anyway, so she was delighted when she came across this pot of funding from the British Medical Research Council, which was specifically aimed at benefiting low and middle income countries. So she thought, well, this is great. Obviously, this will be wonderful. There's all these women dying. I can probably help them. I'll definitely get this money. Of course, you know the end of the story. She did not get the money. And the reason she did not get the money was that the study was not deemed a high enough priority. Now, I'd just like to read you a short extract from Invisible Women about the impact of our exclusion of pregnant women from medical data, because this goes far beyond these kinds of trials. So, because of their routine exclusion from clinical trials, we lack solid data on how to treat pregnant women for pretty much anything. We may not know how a disease will take hold or what the likely outcome may be, although the World Health Organization warns that many diseases can have particularly serious consequences for pregnant women or can harm the fetus. Some strains of influenza virus, particularly the 2009 H1N1 swine flu virus, have particularly severe symptoms during pregnancy. There is also evidence that SARS can be more severe during pregnancy. It is, of course, understandable that a pregnant woman may be reluctant to take part in medical research, but this doesn't mean that we just have to throw up our hands in the air and accept that we know nothing. We should be routinely and systematically tracking, recording, and collating pregnant women's health outcomes. But we aren't, not even during pandemics. During the 2002-04 SARS outbreak in China, pregnant women's health outcomes were not systematically tracked, and consequently, the WHO points out, it was not possible to fully characterize the course and outcome of SARS during pregnancy. And then I finished the paragraph by saying, another gender data gap that could have been so easily avoided, and information that will be lacking for when the next pandemic hits. So yeah, we don't have that data, and the next pandemic is upon us, and we haven't got a fucking clue what we're doing. So a not unconnected issue to this is the way that we seem to forget that women carry on giving birth even, by the way, I know that seems quite crass. I'm not happy that we don't have that data. A not unconnected issue is the way we seem to collectively forget that women carry on giving birth even in a crisis setting, even when there's been an earthquake or a tornado or a tidal wave or some other kind of natural disaster like disease outbreak. And the result is that maternal mortality rates tend to shoot up in these kinds of crisis scenarios. So, for example, following the Philippines 2013 typhoon, in which 4 million people were left homeless, an estimated 1,000 women were giving birth every single day, with almost 150 of them expected to have life-threatening conditions. Birthing facilities had been destroyed by the typhoon and women were dying. So there was an urgent need for funding. but nobody wanted to provide any. And in fact, the United Nations Population Fund asked donor nations for funds to provide things like hygiene kits, staff at temporary maternity wards. They managed to raise only 10% of the money that was needed. They didn't have that problem in the other areas of money that they were looking for. During the Ebola outbreak in West Africa, maternal health clinics were actually closed because we diverted resources to the outbreak response. Consequently, the maternal mortality rate in the region, which is already one of the highest in the world, increased by 70%. And these life-threatening failures of ours to account for sex and gender in crisis settings goes beyond maternity. For example, our failure to account for the increased risk of women during these kinds of outbreaks caused by women's increased exposure because of women's tendency to be the ones giving the care in these kinds of scenarios. So, for example, in Liberia, during the 2014 Ebola epidemic, women were estimated to make up 75% of those who died from the disease. In Sierra Leone, UNICEF estimated that up to 60% of those who died were women. Data from the most recent Ebola outbreak in DRC indicate that 2/3 of people infected are women. So clearly there's some kind of gender component going on here that you might think we would like to look into. And yet, a recent analysis of 29 million papers in over 15,000 peer-reviewed titles published around the time of the Zika and Ebola outbreaks found that less than 1% explored the gendered impact of outbreaks. Now, this isn't just a problem for women, it's a problem for everyone who is within the context of an outbreak, because actually by failing to account for gender, you can stymie containment efforts. So, for example, failure to account for gender during the 2009 swine flu virus outbreaks meant that government officials kept talking to men because they assumed that they were the ones who were the farmers. Actually, the farmers were women, and that was a huge problem in trying to contain the disease. During the 2014 Ebola outbreak in Sierra Leone, initial quarantine plans ensured that women received food supplies, but not fuel or water. Now, in these countries, women travel for a very long way to get the fuel and water that they need on a daily basis. But because they were given food but no means to cook the food, women carried on moving outside of the quarantine zone and spreading the virus. Interestingly enough, this is not the only time that we've done something as seemingly incredibly stupid as that. I found several occasions, actually, where in following sort of natural disasters, when temporary homes were being built, they forgot to put in kitchens. Who needs a kitchen? You don't need to eat. The food, or you need to eat, but the food just magically appears. You don't need to cook it. Anyway, so it's amazing how often this kind of thing happens. Anyway, so to carry on upsetting and depressing you, I'm going to tell you about why the data gap in health is set to get a whole lot more scary. So as you all know, only middle-aged men get heart attacks. Obviously, this is not true. As we've already been through, heart disease is the #1 killer of women in the US and Europe. Women from lower socioeconomic backgrounds are 25% more likely to suffer a heart attack than men in the same income bracket. Women are 50% more likely to be misdiagnosed if they have a heart attack in the UK. They're also more likely to die. So why do, we have all this data, why do the Google image search results present this as a almost wholly male problem? Well, simply because that's the data we've been feeding it. And even if you do have a little bit of female data in it, the problem is with the way the algorithms work. They amplify the bias that you feed them. So they don't just reflect our own biases back to us, which would be bad enough. They amplify them by a significant amount. So there was a quite scary study that came out in 2017 by the University of Washington, which looked at how big this amplification effect was by training an algorithm on this very commonly used image data set, which happened to have a bias whereby pictures of cooking were 33% more likely to include women than men. But by the time the algorithm was done being trained on it, the disparity had increased to 68%. What did that mean? It meant that the algorithm was labeling pictures of men as women just because they were standing in front of a stove. Now, that obviously is not the end of the world, apart from a man who has a serious problem with being labeled female. But you can see how dangerous that can be when we start applying these algorithms into the medical world, which indeed we are. So last year I came across a paper which claimed that they were developing this algorithm that was going to be able to predict heart attacks 5 years before they occurred. When you read the paper, it's a little bit concerning, because it turned out that the trials on which the algorithm was trained were heavily male-dominated, and the paper provided very little sex-disaggregated data. So it's very hard to know whether we're actually factoring this in or not. Why is that particularly worrying? Well, it's worrying because we know there are different risk factors for women versus men when it comes to heart disease. Smoking is a higher risk factor for women. Diabetes is a higher risk factor for women. So a gender-neutral risk prediction algorithm just isn't going to cut it. So how do we fix this? Well, Henry Higgins is how we don't fix it. So Henry Higgins, for those of you who are not, inexplicably, are not lovers of musical theatre, is the romantic lead. He doesn't look like it, but he is the romantic lead in My Fair Lady, which has got some banging tunes, one of which is when Henry Higgins himself sings, "Why can't a woman be more like a man?" And this is something, a tendency that I came up against again and again in the course of my research. Most notably, I think, in the comments by the CEO of a voice recognition software for cars, which, like most voice recognition softwares, doesn't really recognize female voices. The reason for that being, it's mainly trained on male voices. That's a pretty easy one to fix. You just record some female voices and train the algorithm on it. Done. But anyway, that's not what this guy thought. This guy was like, yeah, it's a problem that our voice recognition software doesn't recognize women's voices. So, what we suggest is that women undergo hours of lengthy training to fix the many issues with women's voices. But it also crops up in far more benign areas. You see it in all sorts of attempts, really, well-intentioned attempts to fix, for example, promotion gaps, gender pay gaps. Women need to have confidence training. They need to be trained in their negotiation skills. Well, actually, it turns out women tend to ask for salary increases as much as men. They're just much less likely to get them. So when you look at the data, you start wondering, well, is it a problem with women's confidence, or is it a problem with a system that hasn't been set up to account for discrimination? And maybe that is the problem. So I am going to close almost exactly on time, which is pretty impressive. So this is a very funny picture. I'm sure you'll all agree. It's got nothing to do with the conclusion. I just think it's really funny. And I took it when I went to visit a car crash test dummy manufacturer. It's the only one in the UK, and this is their flesh drop-off point, Anyway, the reason that I went to visit this car crash test dummy manufacturer is because I really wanted to find out why it is that we still don't seem to be able to create a female car crash test dummy, the result of which is that women are 47% more likely to be seriously injured if they're in a car crash, and 17% more likely to die. So there's no female flesh being dropped off at that point, just male flesh. Anyway, so what do I want you to take away from this fascinating and hilarious talk? Well, first of all, men are not a standard that women fail to live up to. And really, if you take nothing else away from the talk, that is the main thing. And the reason that I think that is the main thing is because that is a bias that unless we recognize it in ourselves, we won't ever fix this. Because you see this bias at the heart of everything that I've been talking about, and other more concerning things, like the excuses that I get from medical researchers of why they can't include women in their trials. Women are just too complicated. The menstrual cycle will interfere with the results. Well, yeah, it will, but the menstrual cycle exists, and it'll interfere with the results in real life. But what I find really interesting about that excuse is that it presents females, the female body as this sort of weird, complicating factor, rather than, the body that represents half of humanity. And even more interesting one I find is when researchers say, well, we'll start off in men, the default sex, and then if we find anything interesting, we'll add women at a later date, the complicating factor. But that doesn't work either. I mean, for a start, it just very, very clearly shows how the researchers who say this are thinking of men as the default sex. But also, I mean, what's really fascinating about it is that these are medical researchers, so they know that sexed cells are a thing, and that sexed cells can respond differently. And so it doesn't make sense to start off in men as if they're a default neutral sex, because they're not. They're one sex, and then there's the other sex, and you have to test on them both. So, for example, one study that I came across which really pissed me off was they took 2 cells, well, probably more than 2 cells, but they took male and female cells, and then they exposed them to estrogen, and then they exposed them to a virus. Now, the female cells were able to use the estrogen to fight off the virus. The male cells were not able to use the estrogen to fight off the virus. But what if we'd only done the study in male cells? You know, thinking, well, if we find anything interesting in men, we'll add women at a later date. Just the other day, I read another study. Wasn't a study, actually. It was an article about someone trying to get funding for his study on microdosing of LSD. And just, you know, totally throwaway line, the author of the article said, you know, if he gets funding for this study, he'll collect a bunch of healthy men, and, you know, and then he actually, the author of the study actually said, you know, and we'll be able to know from this whether there's anything further to be looked into. What? No, you won't. Anyway, so men are not a standard that women fail to live up to. 2, collect sex disaggregated data. That's just fucking standard. 3, remember, diversity isn't a tick box. Now, I haven't spoken a lot about that, but it is a really important part of it. And it goes back to the very beginning where I was talking about the mistakes that you can make when you can collect data. So how you analyze data, what questions you're asking, what is the problem you think you're trying to solve. And I just want to close with an example of how the makeup of your team can really affect whatever it is you end up producing. So Apple created their health tracker app that they called Comprehensive in 2014. And it was very comprehensive, right? You could track your molybdenum, which I'm sure you all track. And you could also track your copper intake, which I personally track religiously. But you couldn't track your period. Right? Now, women track their periods. They want to know, should I wear white trousers today? I'm going on holiday. Do I need to pack some ibuprofen and some Tampax? And the thing that I think is really interesting about that example is that I don't believe for 1 second that Apple was like, fuck women, fuck periods, you know, we're not including them in our comprehensive health tracker app. No, they just forgot that periods exist. Why did they forget that periods exist? Because they didn't have enough people who have periods, probably in fact any people who have periods, on their design team. And that is how they made the very embarrassing error that they then had to fix 2 years later. I don't know why it took them 2 years to fix it. Probably that's how long it took to get a woman on the team. Anyway, so thank you very much, and I invite you back on the stage.
Thank you. I've just been with your French is gorgeous. Thanks very much. I mean, I think that was amusing, interesting, and terrifying in equal measure. So I hope that was what you were aiming for. So I think we have actually got time for probably a couple of questions from the audience. If you can take a mic.
Is this water
Yeah.
for me?
In fact,
Has it got coronavirus on it, though?
Okay.
That's the question.
Thank you so. Thank you so much for this. What do we do when so many of the health issues that women experience aren't in the medical models in the first place?
Sorry, I was spending all that time trying to find you. Can you repeat your question? I'm sorry.
Of course. What should we do? Horrible echo. What should we do if a lot of the health... Sorry, can we get rid of that echoing feedback, please?
I can hear you fine.
Okay, thank you. So what do we do when the health issues that women face aren't in the medical models properly in the first place? So not only do we not have the pathways and protocols, but we actually risk not being measured in the first place.
So what do we do if... Oh, thank you. Thanks very much. You say if we haven't collected the data in the first place. Collect the data. I mean, yeah, that's what we need to do. Sorry, I was speaking very loud because I was kind of trying to shout over the people at the back, which I know is stupid, but I'm human. I mean, that's the only answer I can give you. The answer is we have to collect the data. We don't have the data and we have to collect it. It's as simple as that. And yeah, it's not going to get fixed overnight because there's a hell of a lot of data that we have to collect. But there's no other way to fix it. It's very unfortunate that we haven't been doing it before now. And so there are so many holes to be filled. And in all sorts of areas, like if you think about occupational health, where it takes decades for us to be able to say whether or not something causes cancer, for example, it's going to take decades for enough people to die, enough women to die, for us to know whether that's an area that we need to address. So we have to start collecting the data now, and as much of it as possible.
So any other questions? Goodness, that was a bit of a shock. I've probably got time for one or two. Just at the front here. Goodness, that was a bit. Oof.
Digital in healthcare is a relatively new
Can you speak
sorry,
up a bit?
digital in healthcare is a relatively new area, but in terms of leadership already, it's highly male dominated. And through reading your book and I've read what you wrote and very much kind of see it on the ground, having those groups of leaders who are more diverse does bring that wider view and including women, and you don't see what you're not looking for. What would be your best piece of advice to the people in this audience who are leaders, male and female, to change that imbalance, which is really quite depressing given the fact that we know diversity is really important and that it's such a new, relative young area already. It's very biased towards men.
Quotas. They have a really bad rap, but they work. That's probably why they have a bad rap. And all the research that has been done into quotas has found that actually women, that they don't end up hiring underqualified women. What they do is weed out mediocre men. That sucks if you're a mediocre man, but what can I say? Don't be mediocre and you'll be fine. But yeah, quotas are really the best way to do it, the easiest way to do it. Other ways are radical transparency about hiring and promotion decisions, which if you really, really commit to it, has been shown to really work, actually. But you have to commit to it, and it has to be a long-term project. So one of those two.